Hello everyone. Our topic this week was requested by all of these lovely people. We'll be going over Sol Badguy from the Guilty Gear franchise. Spoilers for the Guilty Gear franchise. Les deux.
Okay, so, first things first. Sol Badguy is the series protagonist, and he is not, by most definitions, actually a bad guy.
You are bad guy, but this does not mean you're bad guy.
The Guilty Gear franchise takes place in an alternate future version of Earth. Sol's age is technically unknown, but there's enough information available for us to say that by the most recent game, which takes place around 2187, he's likely between the ages of 201 and 205, meaning he was born sometime in the 1980s. But to understand what's going on in the world and how and why Sol is that old, we need to do a bit of world setup. The Guilty Gear verse diverges from the real-world history right around the year 2000. As far as we know, all real-world history and GG history matches up until late 1999, early 2000, with one exception. Magic is real in the GG verse.
In the GG verse, there is a domain called the backyard, a dimension that sort of under or overlays our perceived reality. The backyard is the source of all magic, and like magic, is in-universe alternatively referenced using programming or musical terminology, with some points of information inferring that everything in the real world is a result of information and tasks run in the backyard, comparing the backyard to computer hardware and reality to the software that the backyard is running. Despite this, we know that the real world can affect the backyard as well, as there is a very important example of such an event we'll go over later. Regardless of all that, despite its existence, magic was seemingly unknown to most of humanity for the majority of history. Magic and the backyard were discovered by a man known only as the Original sometime in the late 1900s. He physically entered the backyard, a feat later revealed to be very difficult and inherently dangerous, and then developed the basis for the study and practice of magic used in the game's modern day. He also created a magical construct that was later be dubbed the Universal Will, an artificial intelligence designed with the directive to ensure eternal happiness for humanity without harming humanity in the process. Unfortunately, like so many AIs, the Universal Will evolved beyond its base programming in the worst way possible. The Original failed to define humanity when programming the construct. Resultantly, in order to pursue its directive, the Universal Will had to define the parameters of what it meant to be human on its own. In doing so, it concluded that humanity did not yet truly exist, and that humanity in its current state needed to be washed away in order for true humanity to take its place. The Universal Will had great power, but could not directly act in the physical world without a way to manifest there, and so began to work on doing so.
The Original, unable or unwilling to destroy his creation, instead tried to warn humanity and head the Universal Will off at the pass. He knew his construct could use the vast array of telecommunications technology the world over to manifest into the physical world, and so he warned the globe to step away from technology before it was too late, which went about as well as expected. Most of the world ignored him, but he did gain 5 disciples who set about working with him on laying the groundwork for programs to transition the world from electronics and technology-based infrastructure to a magically based infrastructure. A few years passed, and the Universal Will manifested as the GG verse's answer to the Y2K bug. Technology the world over went on the fritz as the year 2000 loomed. Coupled with a spike in natural disasters and the Universal Will's clear announcement of itself as an entity trying to materialize, in a panic, virtually all world governments shut down and outlawed technology in the surprisingly successful hope of keeping this largely unknown but clearly hostile thing from gaining power and stepping into the world. As society collapsed without technology, the Original and his disciples stepped in, teaching people magic and showing them how to use it to replace the various technologies of the world. Their efforts were successful, and in the modern day, seemingly normal appliances like refrigerators, microwaves, lights, and even vehicles all seem largely indistinguishable from our real-world counterparts, but run on various forms of magic instead of electricity.
Enter Sol Badguy. Born Frederick Bulsara sometime in the 1980s, Fred and his peers experienced the events of the GG Millennium Bug firsthand, meaning he was alive to witness the transition from technology to magic. In the wake of these events, Fred pursued an education in magical physics, attending college to gain his degree and becoming close friends with 2 of the most important characters in the GG verse, Arya and Asuka, fellow students of magical fields of study. Seemingly unbeknownst to the others, Asuka was also one of the Original's 5 disciples. Why was he a student there? The trio bonded, with Fred and Arya eventually dating, and in 2014, after graduation, they all got jobs working on what would come to be known as the Gear Project, with Asuka becoming the head of the project within a year of their employment. The goal of the Gear Project, broadly speaking, was the improvement of human life, with goals such as ending human illness once and for all and other such lofty aims. Within a year, they made their first breakthrough, the creation of stable gear cells. When properly introduced to a host, gear cells reduced or halted aging, strengthened the body in virtually every way, even granted superhuman capabilities, but in the early stages there were still a number of drawbacks, and so the work continued. Beings altered in this way almost invariably carried a brand marking them for what they were, and became known as Gears.
During their work on the Gear Project, Fred and Asuka learned that Arya had long suffered from an incurable and fatal disease. Knowing that there was no cure now, but also that they were literally working on life-altering projects on a daily basis, both of her friends urged Arya to submit to cryo-freezing in the hopes of finding a cure for her down the line. She stubbornly refused, however, believing that if she woke up decades later to be cured and found that her two closest friends were dead and gone, it wouldn't really be any different than if she died sooner. Instead, she planned to enjoy the time she had left with those closest to her. Fred was both devastated and furious, but resigned to the fact that he couldn't change Arya's mind. But Asuka approached her privately with a plan. He assured Arya that he could render Fred effectively immortal and would do so if she would put herself in stasis so that they could find a cure. Noting that way Arya would have her loved ones around her still and could then continue living a full life, giving everyone the best of both worlds. Asuka is also alive by the time of the games, granting himself immortality through different means, which it can be assumed was mentioned to Arya as well. Eventually, Arya agreed, going into cryostasis, while Asuka transformed Fred into a very special gear without Fred's consent. We're certain there was a logical reason that he chose this plan rather than, say, doing the exact same thing to Arya, rendering her effectively immortal, but we can't say for certain.
World governments have become heavily involved in the funding of the Gear Project by this point, and while steps have been made to legally curtail their influence, the trio's fears of government direction were realized in 2016, coinciding almost exactly with the timing of Arya's freezing and Fred's transformation. One thing that most of the members of the Gear Project had agreed on from day one was that their discoveries shouldn't be used for warfare. They were trying to save the world, not build the next generation of weaponry. But the governments funding them wanted access to the Gear Project partially for those exact purposes. Their lab was caught in an accident that, combined with Asuka's plans and Fred's post-transformation rampaging, left very little of the project intact. Combining Fred's forced transformation and the timing of the destruction of their lab, Fred's death was effectively faked to the world at large, which worked out well for him because Asuka disappeared with Arya's cryopod that same night, and misunderstandings with a possibly retconned interaction between Fred and Asuka led to Fred vowing vengeance on his once friend. Asuka vanished into the ether, and Fred spent the next several decades trying to track him down. With Fred and Asuka having vanished and Arya and cryostasis in Asuka's possession, that left the Gear Project both in tatters and without any of its top researchers. Eventually, without their guidance, the project was abandoned and wouldn't be opened again until 2042. In the interim, Fred used his newfound powers and his impressive magical education to become a bounty hunter, tracking criminals and single-handedly taking down underworld organizations in his quest to find Asuka, who would eventually come to be known as That Man. Fred abandoned his old name as well, taking on the names given him by the people around him. He developed a reputation in the criminal underworld for all the problems he caused them, coming to be known simply as the Bad Guy, capital B. He also made the acquaintance of a vampire who claimed that Fred's life and drive shined like the sun, so the vampire started calling Fred Sol, as in our son. Some point on the line, Fred simply accepted both of these names and became known as Sol Badguy.
After his transformation into a gear, Sol essentially became the character we see in the games in terms of his powers and capabilities. After teaching the world to use magic instead of science, the original left his disciples behind to take care of things and dipped back into the backyard to continue his studies. But before he left, he entrusted Asuka with 2 seeds. The backyard contained 2 powerful quasi-beings that, when brought together, caused a bleed-over effect between the backyard and the real world that wipes out everything. This had happened periodically throughout time and is the GG-verse explanation for events in Earth's history, like the dinosaurs going extinct. To ensure this wouldn't happen again, the original had locked the 2 of them into separate seeds sometime earlier. These were the seeds entrusted to Asuka, and, as one might expect, each contained phenomenal levels of power. To ensure the success of Asuka's plan to render Fred effectively immortal, he implanted one of these seeds into Fred as part of his transformation into a gear. immediately making Fred, or Sol, one of the 2 strongest gears ever to exist, despite the fact that as decades passed, advancements in the process led to generally better, more powerful gears. The only gear that could ever match Sol was the one Asuka would later plant the other seed in. More on that later. As a gear, Sol has superhuman strength, durability, and a healing factor. The magic in his gear cells grants him virtually unlimited energy, and he has a natural affinity for fire magic. Because he was implanted with one of the seeds, the levels of power he gained as a gear are orders of magnitude beyond virtually any other gear. His physical strength and magical might is awesome. His regenerative capabilities are so great that he's virtually unkillable, and while he has been canonically defeated, his life has almost never been in danger of being snuffed out, and this is all with his power suppressed. In the early days after his conversion, he developed his headband, a piece of magitech that suppresses the vast majority of his power, enabling him to pass as human and covering his gear mark, which rests on his forehead. He can remove the headband, activating his latent powers and turning into a fiery monster, dialing all of his capabilities up to 11. In-game, this is used to represent his super attacks. On top of all of this, Sol is a brilliant magical scientist and has created some of the most potent artifacts in the franchise, including the various swords he uses throughout the series, all of which magnify the effectiveness of his fire magic to varying degrees.
In 2042, about 2.5 decades after Sol was transformed into a gear, one of the world's governments reopened the Gear Project with the express purpose of creating weaponized gears. Sol, opposed to this idea, vowed to destroy every gear he could get his hands on, well aware of and somewhat disgusted with his own nature as a gear, considering he and all gears to be monsters. Asuka also opposed the idea of weaponized gears and secretly joined the new Gear Project to learn the ins and outs of their creation and programming. Decades passed and gears began being mass-produced and shipped worldwide as the newest and best weapons that money could buy. Not only were they powerful, but they largely lacked wills of their own, making them easily controllable as well. In 2073, with his understanding of gears complete, Asuka thawed out Arya and turned her into a gear using the second seed, granting her power comparable to Sol's. But Arya was also designed with the express intent and ability to control all of the world's gears. Asuka and Arya's plan was to assert control of the gears and remove them from the field of play as weapons, helping, if not to ensure peace, at least to ensure that their research wouldn't be used for war. But during Arya's first test run, things went awry. The Universal Will had never given up on its plans to wipe out and reshape humanity, and chose this moment to try once more to insert itself into the world. It attempted to use a combination of Arya's powerful new gear body and the presence of the innocent citizenry nearby as a catalyst to assist in that assimilation. Arya tried to mentally fight it off, but it was no use, and the people began to warp to the Universal Will's whims. Seeing no other option, Asuka took control of Arya's body remotely and used her power to nuke the entire civilization, robbing the Universal Will of most of the fuel required to enter our world. However, the combination of the Will's assault on Arya's mind and her awareness of, but inability to stop herself from wiping out hundreds of millions of people fractured her psyche, all but completely forgetting herself, her past, and Asuka's plans. She took on the name Justice, united all gears under her banner, and started a 100-year-long war with humanity.
The 100-year war with the gears became known as the Crusades. And the real danger of the gears wiping out humanity was so great that the human race's collective hopes, dreams, and drive for a better future manifested a living being inside of the backyard during the Crusades. Before she finished being born, the original found her, as he'd been kicking around in the Boundary for several decades by that point. Upon finding her, he also discovered that as the manifestation of a hope for a brighter future, she was to be born as an all-powerful, all-knowing being whose very existence would threaten the fabric of reality. So he separated her from roughly half of her power, leaving her bereft of the knowledge of who she was and what her purpose had been. Resultantly, she was born into the world as a powerful time traveler known as Ino, and would end up working as one of Asuka's agents once Asuka realized who and what she was. For the original's part, shortly after separating Ino's power from her, he clashed with the Universal Will, who bound that power to him, knowing it would be too much for him to handle. Straining under the pressure of becoming something resembling all-knowing, the original's mind cracked and he became a vaguely villainous character who went by the name Happy Chaos. He spent years sowing chaos on Earth while in disguise before the Universal Will managed to manifest itself inside the body of one of the world's religious leaders, who then absorbed Happy Chaos as well. granting the will tremendous power. Most of this information will not be revealed until some years later, however.
Much of Asuka's project and the specifics of the research of that project were lost in the destruction that led to Justice's rise. As such, he came to be blamed for Justice's creation, with people believing he'd created her on purpose, earning Asuka the status of villain the world over and giving him the simple title, That Man. Sol was among those who believed the tale, and seeing Justice's power, he crafted a super weapon that was capable of one-shotting virtually anything, including her. However, the backlash proved to be great enough that even Sol, virtually unkillable as he was, found the thing too dangerous to use, so he broke it down into its component parts and allowed those parts to spread across the globe, one of which was his flame-enhancing sword. Sol spent most of the Crusades destroying gears on his own. Near the end of the war, however, he joined up with a cadre of knights who had long been humanity's shield and sword in the war. There, he met Kai for the first time, starting a series-long frenemy rivalry between the two. They were borderline polar opposites of each other, but while they shifted from hating each other's guts to being begrudgingly tolerant of the other, there was always an acknowledgement between the two of the similarity in their levels of strength and skill. In fact, the two dueled numerous times throughout the series. Sol won all but one of those battles, but was always annoyed because Kai always held back in said duels, since he didn't consider Sol a true enemy in need of killing. Regardless of their differences, through their combined efforts, they ended the war. Sol defeated Justice, unaware of her identity as Arya, and Kai and his knights sealed her into a magical prison.
5 years later, in 2180, the first Guilty Gear game begins. Yes, that was all backstory! After Justice's defeat, the vast majority of gears were rendered inert, having no master to guide their will, while the handful of fully cognizant and functional gears fled into hiding. One gear, though, hatched a scheme to free and revive Justice, organizing a tournament where the powerful could truly throw down, where blood could be freely spilled, and from which the winner's prize would be the granting of any single wish their heart desired. Sol sensed something amiss with the tournament and entered, claiming victory. The gear who organized things admitted his plans, informing Sol that by then he only needed one more person's blood to break the seal on Justice's prison. Trying to stop him, Sol defeated the gear, but the seal wasn't picky about whose blood was spilled, and so Justice was freed anyway. This time, Sol fully kills Justice, still unaware of her nature as Arya, though she regained enough of her sense of self during her final moments to wish she, Sol, and Asuka could have had one last moment together. A sentiment that confuses Sol and leads him to renewing his vow to find and kill Asuka. About a year later, the world loses its collective mind when the story starts circulating of the existence of a gear that was functional and conscious all on her own. Since the world was largely unaware of other sentient gears as they liked to hide, this sparked fear of a second Justice and a second Crusade. A massive bounty was placed on her head, and Sol, still a bounty hunter, went to investigate. He defeated her, but finding her to be largely pacifistic despite her immense power allowed her to live and left her be. It's unclear whether or not Sol suspected the truth at the time, but many games later, after she joins Sol's allies and marries his rival Kai, it is revealed that she is the half-human, half-gear daughter of Justice, making Sol the most likely candidate as her father since Arya/Justice had no other known mates. Questions of cryo-frozen mutated embryos aside, this revelation, which made Sol and Kai in-laws, is treated by the two as arguably more devastating than the world-ending plots they're constantly trying to stop.
Sol's adventures continue in the weeks following his sparing of his daughter, as among other things, he is thrown into the past by Ino and forced to battle his younger Crusade-era self. Eventually, though, he returns to the present, and we don't see him again until a few years later, where he agrees to raise Kai and his daughter's son, Sol's grandson. The revelation of her being his daughter is not made at this point, it will happen later. In part because Kai has become a sort of king, and they both think it would be best if Sol's grandson were raised away from that. A few years pass, and Sol and his grandson are traveling as a bounty hunter duo when they see a bounty notice for Sol put out by Kai, which they correctly deduce is Kai's way of calling for Sol, since he has no way to know where Sol might be. When they arrive in Kai's kingdom, they find it under attack. Sol's daughter is in stasis and Kai is severely wounded. The Universal Will had created a series of constructs mystically related to Arya, as it believed that Justice's body was the perfect vessel for itself, and since Justice was both dead and broken, her body needed to be fixed in order to act as a functional vessel. To that end, the Aria constructs all contained key pieces of Aria's backyard information that would allow Justice to become whole if an Aria construct and Justice's body merged, but also leave the body under the Universal Will's control. The Will then proceeded to work on several fronts to secure its objectives. One such avenue involved the attack on Kai's kingdom. Asuka had created a structure in the backyard that theoretically allowed for the manipulation of the real world, something that would allow the Universal Will to accomplish virtually any of its desires. But it was locked tight, and the key was someone with one of the seeds, i.e. Sol or Arya/Justice, or, barring access to either of them, Sol's daughter or grandson, who had inherited enough of the seed's mystical genetic markers to act as keys as well. So, the Will's forces attacked Kai's kingdom in order to acquire Sol's daughter. When Kai trapped her at a barrier rather than see her destroyed, they changed tactics and abducted Sol's grandson after the two arrived on the scene. Sol then defeated his brainwashed grandson, fought Asuka, who used the battle as a test for Sol and his friends, before granting them passage into the backyard, and then Sol defeated the Arya construct who'd been managing all these attacks, and ensured that no one would ever be able to enter Asuka's little reality warping structure again. And these events renewed Sol's hatred for Asuka once more.
Despite Sol's angst, Asuka informed Sol that the Arya construct he defeated wasn't the only one, and that the Universal Will would send more to sow havoc and destroy humanity. As a response, Sol decided to revisit his plans for that superweapon he'd originally designed to kill Justice all those years ago. Retrieving some of the scattered parts, he created a more compact, less powerful version that still packed an unbelievable punch, but had a backlash that was more manageable. In its dormant state, it also doubled as his newest flame magic enhancing sword. Not long later, another of the Arya constructs appears, declaring war on the world itself, and Sol and Co. head out to stop her. The plan to stop her becomes complicated though when they learn that another hidden faction is using these events to try and take out the interfering parties like Sol and revive Justice at a later date. They manage to defeat and even befriend the newest Arya construct and remove the hidden faction's influence on Justice, only for the Universal Will's plan to come into fruition when another Arya construct fuses with Justice. But they manage to awaken the Arya construct within afterwards, which throws a wrench into the Will's plans. Despite this, the construct and Justice are whisked off to parts unknown, and Sol and friends start trying to track them down. During this time, Sol, who has by this point spent over 100 years traveling the world predominantly alone and stewing in anger and hatred, gets some character development in the form of some wake-up calls about life, kindness, and the need for more than just vengeance, predominantly from his blood family with a little bit of nudging from Kai as well.
When they find Justice and the Construct, they fully thwart all the Universal Will's plans, even defeating the Will's human host. While all of this is going on, an Arya construct created by Asuka named Jacko fuses with Justice to properly reconstitute Arya. Despite the seemingly happy ending moment here, the world's governments had been aware of all of these attempts to revive Justice, and not taking any chances, one of them had sent forces to glass the entire region, unwilling to take any chance on Justice's revival. In a surprise twist, the Universal Will's host saved everyone, seeing potential in the changes in its Arya construct that had been wrought by their friendships with Sol and the crew, and thus wanting to preserve their lives. The effort spent virtually all of the Will's strength, however, and its human host was taken into custody for the Will's crimes against humanity. Weeks pass with Sol and Jacko working together as bounty hunters, bonding and getting to know each other. Arya's soul had evidently been repaired completely, but her consciousness had yet to reawaken. Jacko, like the other Arya constructs, was struggling with her grasp on what it meant to be alive, and so joined with Sol and awaited Arya's reemergence, resigned to letting her own sense of self eventually disappear.
While all of that's going on, Ino busts into the prison where the Universal Will's vessel is being detained and rips Happy Chaos out of it. The two then peace out and split up, with Happy Chaos carrying half of Ino's being, planning to merge the two together so that Ino can once again become the reality-breaking, godlike entity she originally was. But to do that, they needed a bit of magic glue that only Asuka possessed, so Happy Chaos and Ino manipulate events to bring most of Sol and his crew together, including Asuka. The resultant events lead to Sol being rendered human once more with the removal of his seed after everyone believed Happy Chaos to be defeated, only for Happy Chaos to reveal his deception on the subject and subsequently fuse he and Ino together, allowing her to ascend to reality-breaking status once more. Jacko seemed to be the only answer to the problem, as she had the power to sacrifice herself and depower Ino in the process. She began doing so only for Sol to talk her out of it, claiming there was another way. The final argument that convinced Jacko to step back from her noble sacrifice was that Sol admitted that he wasn't waiting for Arya, that he'd been spending time with Jacko for Jacko and not for the Arya that might never come. Afterward, with a lot of help from their companions, Sol used his superweapon sword to defeat Eno. The toll it took on his body was initially severe without his tremendous regeneration powers, but they were wounds from which he would ultimately recover. In the aftermath, Asuka took the ship they had battled on, along with the most dangerous secrets of the recent events, to the moon, where theoretically no one could follow, while Sol and Jacko retired to live quietly in the middle of nowhere together. Though Sol is seen building a spacecraft, presumably to go see Asuka on the moon, in their backyard.
And that's basically Sol Badguy, the titular Guilty Gear of the franchise. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave us a like and share it with someone you know might like it. If you have ideas for videos you'd like to see in the future, do like all of these lovely people and let us know in the comments down below. If you'd like to see more videos, hit that subscribe button, and if you'd like to see our Let's Plays, follow the link in the description and subscribe to our Let's Play channel.
In the meantime, this has been
True Masters and Morons, signing off.